Hello, everyone. This is Channing Dutton, and along with my co-hosts David Thorson and Chris Cloninger, we are live on YouTube TV or YouTube right now. Be sure to look for us on Spotify and on Substack. Please give us a like, and if you like the show, drop us a review as well. It is a snowy day in Iowa. We just got hit with 11 inches as we transition from November to December. But on Halloween, something important happened for all of you who have Netflix accounts, and that is a new documentary has dropped. This needs to go on your top of the list. It's called The White House Effect, and I'll flip it to Chris to start talking about our guest today and introduce both the documentary and the director.
Yeah, it's funny, Channing. My wife actually put this on my radar, no pun intended, and I try to remove myself some of the time from all things climate because it is all encompassing, right? It's my full-time job, it's my hobby, it's my passion, but I sometimes find the right movie or the right documentary to watch, and really this hit all the marks. It was such a tremendous film that has, again, just been phenomenal. It's blown up across Netflix, and I learned so much through it as a climate communicator, as a broadcast meteorologist. And our guest today, we shared the same time slot or the time block at COP30. It's We Don't Have Time. They're a Swedish organization. They do a lot of climate communication, and they run this 2-week live show from COP. And this year it was in Brazil. We joined remotely. So when I saw her join, I had to invite her onto our podcast. So Bonni Cohen, thank you so much for joining the 3 Degrees podcast. I am going to toss it to David, though, for our first question for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so excited to have Bonni on today. It's just great to have you as a guest. And I'm just so interested in this time frame, this 1988 to 1992 kind of time frame that you focused on. It was a time, I think, for all of us where we didn't really understand climate change at the time, but the scientists were really sort of pulling it together. And of course, James Hansen testified before Congress in '88. Can you tell us how you came up with the idea for this time frame to really focus on how all these ideas, concepts, climate skepticism, presidency, all these things came together at the same time?
Sure. Yeah. Well, my partners in crime on this film, John Schenk and Pedro Cos, we've all made climate films together. And we've been studying the climate crisis and environmental issues in the United States and internationally for years. And we got together with our producer, Josh Penn, and thought, what could we do that could really move the needle? And we, right when we were having that conversation, we had access to this article that Nathaniel Rich wrote in the New York Times Sunday magazine called Losing Earth. And that article focused on this period of time in the late 80s, early 90s, when seemingly there was a convergence of things happening. He was mostly writing about the drama, the political and scientific drama as the science came out, how the politicians were responding. And it sort of catalyzed this idea for us that, what we haven't done is gone back in history into the sort of irrefutable story of history and look at sort of the origins of the climate crisis in this country. What happened and what were the catalyzing events, et cetera. And so we set about this crazy idea of trying to put together an all archival film, just, not picking up a camera, not doing any individual new interviews or any intervention from a contemporary voice, but rather just look at this sort of disciplined 4-year period from 88 to 92, when the following things were happening. We had, unbelievably, a Republican candidate running for president who was pro-environment. He was actually, George Bush Sr. ran as an environmental candidate. There was a drought going on in the United States. Farmers, everyone from farmers to regular people, were suffering as a result of the drought and the results of the drought, both economically and physically. And we had scientists like Stephen Schneider and James Hansen, who you mentioned, and Michael Oppenheimer testifying before Congress about the scientific discoveries that were really being clarified and confirmed around what was causing global warming, what it was, carbon in the atmosphere, how it was affecting us, et cetera. So there was a sort of little window open in the late 80s where there was this convergence of political will. The American people were listening and the science was in. And we thought, what if we could go back and actually tell that story, the drama of that story, and then what happens when Bush actually gets into the White House and what comes from that, what forms from there. So that was the origin of our telling of the origin story of the climate crisis and how we got there. And boy, we amassed about 14,000 different video clips and started to try and create a narrative from there. And it took us 5 years.
So Bonni, when I watched the film, this obviously became a polarizing and politicized issue. And I'm often asked, after I received the death threat in 2016 for talking about climate change in Iowa, when did it become so polarized? And this film taught me something. And I argued, and I still argue to an extent, 2016 was when this part of our society has felt emboldened and empowered to just lash out with hatred, right? And so many times I was told I was just a liberal Biden puppet for talking about climate change. However, this film did such a great job at showcasing the work being done behind the scenes by John Sununu. So can you talk a little bit about his influence on Trump's administration and how Bush essentially did a 180 on the issue?
Yes. So for those of your listeners who don't know the kind of summary of the film, the main drama in the film happens inside the Bush White House. Bush appoints, for the first time ever, into the position of EPA administrator, an actual, conservation, a guy who ran a conservation organization, Bill Riley. And then he appoints as his chief of staff, John Sununu, who is a, kind of rabid conservative, economics forward, doesn't really care about these issues the way Bill Riley does. And the drama that plays out in the White House is that Bush seems actually rather open to discussing the climate crisis and how important it is to move quickly on climate. Bill Riley is, of course, pushing that agenda, and Sununu figures out a way to sort of slam it down. And you see the kind of angel and devil on Bush Sr.'s shoulder fighting it out over the climate crisis. You see in the film, Sununu is early on, he's making the distinction between this sort of false premise that he sets up that, it's in order for the economy to do well, you have to kind of backburner the environment. And he sort of starts to equate and put out the idea into the American people's minds that good environmental policy equals sacrifices for the American people, ones they wouldn't want to make, like not driving their cars or not having heat in the winter or whatever the sacrifice might be. And that kind of false equation that he sort of sets out has echoes today. There's this false premise that there's a political choice to be made by the American people. If you're going to be pro-environment, you're basically saying that you don't care about the economy or that the economy is not going to do well. Well, as we all know, and certainly in the Biden administration, that is the antithesis of what happened because, obviously alternative energy companies are doing very well. Biden's infrastructure plan was set up in a way that was going to be economy forward. But the idea of this kind of seed of disinformation that got planted by John Sununu into the minds of the American people is resonating with us today, and we're still suffering with it.
Bonni, we often joke on the show that one comment or one conversation leads to 10,000 possible lines. And I don't want to fail to tell the viewers, this show is just gripping in terms of the way it was put together. And I'd like you to just give us a little more detail about how you do it from archival sources only, because I am assuming it was a dark room with a couple of computer screens and a bottle of Advil sitting next to you.
You got the wrong bottle there, but yeah.
Okay. Well, yes. But then in particular, I love one of the conventions you use where you take the rising CO2 graph and you roll it back in time when you're taking the story back in time. So who dreamed up that convention? That's every time you did it in the show, I'm just going, oh my goodness, this is good.
For a very long time, the film was called The Curve. We had the idea of calling it The Curve because in our minds, and the Curve was the main character in the film. When the film ends, you see a film by. Usually, when you see a film by, you see the name of the director, or in our case, the name of the 3 directors. We have a film by, and we have about 10 people listed there because this film was made by 3 directors, 3 editors, 3 producers, 4 different archival producers and researchers. I mean, we had this big brain on this film. And we were all kind of toiling away in kind of Willy Wonka's factory, trying to make all of these archival pieces make sense. And that included memos and going to the Bush Library and other presidential libraries to unearth what was really going on at that time and bring it back and bring it to life, for the viewer. In terms of The Curve, we were very, all of us were very moved by how hard it is to visualize when you talk about, you all know this, when you talk better than most people, when you talk to somebody about the climate crisis, it's this ethereal idea. It doesn't feel like it's affecting what I'm doing with, granularly in my life. I may see a weather event, but generally speaking, it's a very hard thing, especially for filmmakers, to visualize for a public. And we started to think about how the graph of CO2 emissions just ticking up slowly. And also when we go back in time, retracting could be very meaningful because it was associating the uptick in carbon with what was happening with corporate America and the use of carbon and our automobiles and machines and computers. And we tried to kind of marry those ideas so that you could feel as an individual American what it meant for our use of these things these conveniences in our lives, what the use case was on the climate uptick, on the carbon uptick. So that became a device that our editors thought would be really effective. John and I and Pedro, we knew we wanted to use The Curve, but then it was the editor's decision to kind of marry it to these increases in manufacturing and uses of carbon forward things that we use in our everyday lives. And I'm hoping that that's an effective device, that you kind of understood that. And then I won't talk about the big reveal at the end of the film when you really find out where we've come with the uptick in carbon.
I was profoundly affected really watching the film, and then toward the end thinking about how in 1992 the United States essentially blew up the first Earth Summit in Rio in Brazil, and then 33 years later in 2025 at COP30, essentially the fossil fuel companies are dominating now our COP process and so affecting what's going on. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are after COP30 and seeing this effect now that you so brilliantly highlighted that was already going on in the early 90s.
Well, yeah, it's a great question. We found that the American public, the climate denial and the climate denialism and the disinformation that was allowed to sort of seep into the American public's ears and hearts was baked in long before Kyoto. What you see in our research showed that starting as early as 1989 in the lead up to what was the pre-COP conference, the Nordvik conference that happened during the Bush administration. It's a little known climate conference that happened in the Netherlands that predated Rio. Sununu and the fossil fuel industry were already working, they were already in cahoots to undermine the scientists and undermine the climate policy. What we highlight in the film, what we found were memos that went back and forth between John Sununu and the fossil fuel executives. They were working together. They were trying to create a narrative that they could then push out through the likes of, Rush Limbaugh and the other big mouthpieces on the American airwaves to kind of, scare the American public away from environmental policy. So by the time you got to Kyoto, that disinformation was already baked in. So it was not at all surprising to remember that, Bush and Clinton and Gore in Kyoto, they got no buy-in from Congress for their climate policy. So we made the decision in the film to only highlight Rio as opposed to the ensuing climate conferences, the COP conferences that happened, because it felt very repetitive. It felt like Groundhog Day. It's like, this kept happening over and over again because we couldn't break through this, what we saw as this initial kind of disinformation-led idea that somehow environmental policy was bad for the American economy.
I assume that this was obviously made before you knew the outcome of the 2024 election. And talk a little bit about the difference between what is happening now compared with what happened when Bush Sr. was in the White House. What's different? What's the same? Are you seeing any parallels? Is this, would you argue, worse? What's going on?
The Bush Sr. White House was kind of quaint as compared to what's going on now. At least he had Bill Riley as his EPA administrator. The EPA now is under Trump is not the EPA anymore. I think that the tribalism and bifurcation of truth and around climate policy is so serious now that I don't think anyone who knows their stuff in the climate policy world is relying at all on federal policy to change and be pro-environment. What is impressive to me, and was impressive when we made An Inconvenient Sequel with Al Gore, as we traveled the country and talked to a lot of climate policy people back in 2016, the local efforts and really significantly, like the mayors in individual American towns and the governors in states across this country, those are the governing bodies that are making a difference in terms of climate policy. And I think, at least until we transition out of this era we're in, the Trump era, those are reliable places to look for impressive pro-climate policy. And the incredible things are happening state to state. And if we can just hold on to that and kind of think about the sustainability of that until we have another president in the White House, to me, that feels like the best way to go. There's no comparison to even what was being talked about in the Bush White House to what's being talked about now. It's just not happening.
Right.
One of the pound your head against the wall moments that I think we all experience is the role of the media. And you do a wonderful job in the documentary of talking about, the media had a passion for it, had a heart for it, had a soul for it. They went with the story, they went with the emerging science, but then they start getting their mojo chipped away. They lose their backbone, they start stepping back, and damn, we are in a stepped back period of media quiescence, media cowardice. On 3 Degrees, this show, we like to talk about what's going to happen in the next 15 years. Your documentary does a wonderful job of setting the stage, but after 5 years and 14,000 clips and putting this together, where do you think the media is going to be able to go in the next 15 years? Are you hopeful? Are you pessimistic?
I'm hopeful about podcasts like yours. The everyday voice of the American people trying to speak truth to power and find the factual basis for writing stories or broadcasting stories about the climate. I hope that it's clear in the film that we are not just pointing the finger at the fossil fuel industry or even mainstream media, but we are also pointing a finger at the American people, how they listen, how they interrogate factual information, what it means in terms of action on behalf of the environment. So, when you receive information as a media consumer, these days it is incumbent upon you to fact check and see, if you can, what the source of the information is and what to do with that information. There is especially with the advent of AI, there is such we're in a new era of trying to discern truth from non-truth. What are the sources? Where are things coming from? So I have I put a lot of faith in the institutions and organizations that are interrogating these issues: ethics in journalism, ethics in documentary film, standards and practices in the era of AI. There's a lot of really good work being done. We know what the right-wing media is, and hopefully, we can discern more over time about how to do something about that. But I am pessimistic still about how those voices, and we show this in the film, are creeping into the bedrooms, car radios, collective televisions where people gather in this country, and you're getting just a steady stream of disinformation, and you have to be able to educate and separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of truth, which, our film is a truth bomb. It is a mic drop on the truth. And so I hope that people will watch it and sort of take it for what it is, which is, history. What is the expression? If you're ignorant of history, you're doomed to repeat it. We've been telling stories about the grand issues of the most important, thing to discuss of our time, the environment and the climate. And we need to keep telling these stories. And the fact that Netflix actually put this film out is positive to me. I mean, that is a way to reach a lot of people. And so there are stories that are still cutting through and making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to me, as someone who grew up, really matured in the late 70s and 80s. I'd lived through that era. And I loved the beginning of your film when you showed so much of those eras and what was going on with MTV and the music and everything that was happening, the birth of kind of environmentalism, some of these things. And I was kind of fascinated with the messaging that was going on at the time, pre-internet. And then you jump to where we are now, and what Channing just posed to you as questions and what you talked about, I find really fascinating. How do we maybe go think beyond where we are now with messaging, and maybe even almost post social media, in a sense, where we're, like, everybody is questioning if what they're seeing is even real with AI. How can we maybe communicate better using AI, or how do we discern the truth and sort of communicate better going forward with all these new tools?
I mean, that is it's not even $1 million question anymore. Or is it even billion? Maybe it's, what's the trillion? That's the $1 trillion question of our time. I worry about us as journalists and documentary filmmakers. What is our role going to be going forward into this era? I think that there is obviously a lot of positivity around AI and what it can do, but also I think we have to be vigilant about how we express to a viewer what they are seeing. If, for example, we had done a recreation in our film because we didn't find what we wanted in the Bush Library of the way in which he was meeting with people in the Oval Office over the Exxon Valdez spill. Let's say we just recreated a scene with Bush talking to journalists about Exxon Valdez, and we inserted it in the middle of all of this archival. And we didn't cop to that fact. You would think that that recreation happened back in the 80s. And that's the kind of thing that really frightens me. So the more that we can educate about what you are actually seeing, I mean, this is the big difference from the Bush White House, in the late 80s. We didn't have all of these tools. And certainly we didn't have the dissemination of disinformation over social media, which is maybe the biggest offender. We have to make sure that we're vigilant about being, especially in our field, about letting viewers know what they are seeing, what they're experiencing.
Channing, I'll toss it to you before we close the show. One last question.
Oh, I'm so glad you did that, because I do want to ask. I was thinking, damn, Chris is going to get the last question. So here's another game we play. We named this show 3 Degrees. And we're not naming it because we're hopeful, but we're worried that maybe we were too high or maybe we were too low. Now, you've had 5 years watching the documentary or watching the footage. Where do you think we're going in terms of, let's say, the year 2070? Do you think 3 degrees is a good guess, or do you think we're too conservative?
I don't think the curve lies. I think if you calculate the curve as you see it at the end of the film in whatever we landed in 2025, it's going up. It's going up. We were on a very good path during the Biden administration in this country towards renewable energies and sustainable paths for the environment. If we've taken a setback, there's no question about that, but we know what to do. So if we can put all of that back in place, we can slow the curve. I wish I was a little bit more optimistic about 3 degrees, but I would guess maybe it's higher.
All right. Bonni Cohen, one of the directors of The White House Effect. It's available now on Netflix. We encourage you all to watch it. It really is a tremendous film. I love it when you don't have to have a narrated track. You can have sound bites that organically go together. It truly is just so well done, Bonni.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. For all of us on the 3 Degrees podcast, my co-host David Thorson, Channing Dutton, I'm Chris Gloninger. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe.
Thank you.